Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Rhiannon. I'm the Campaign and Research Officer at Southwark Group of Tenant Organisations, also known as the SGTO. We're a South London housing federation campaigning for housing rights and council homes. Thank you everyone for joining this meeting. This is to discuss the huge issue of empty homes. We have some of the key commentators here with us today. How the event is shaping is the first hour we'll be discussing 3 main questions, and then 4 until 4:30 there'll be questions from the floor. Please don't unmute yourself, and at the moment we'll just be focusing on the main speakers. We'll start with introductions. So the people who are joining us: Cllr Pollak, Will McMahon, Mark Isherwood and Aujla. I'll invite you now to give a short introduction into who you are and what your position is on empty homes. If we start with Southwark Cabinet Member for Housing, Cllr Pollak.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Thanks so much for organising this event. I know there's been a lot that's gone into it, and particularly the timing of it is really apt for us in Southwark, because we have been developing an empty homes action plan, which will be landing at our cabinet on, I think, February the 2nd. So it's a really great opportunity to discuss the issue of empty homes and get some other perspectives on it. My general position as cabinet member for housing in Southwark, of all places, is that empty homes, every empty home, is a waste and a scandal. We have over 14,000 individuals and families who are sat on our council homes waiting list. We've got over 3,000 homeless families currently in temporary accommodation in our borough. We're trying every which way to increase the amount of affordable housing in the borough, from having a huge council house building programme across 150 sites, delivering 11,000 homes across over a generation, as well as making sure that our planning policies are securing the maximum viable amount of affordable housing possible. But obviously, when it comes to the problem of empty homes, the existing levers and powers and resources that the council has simply aren't sufficient, and we've seen a really kind of depressing increase in the numbers of long-term empty homes in Southwark over the past year, partly to do with the pandemic and perhaps linked to the experience of students perhaps not staying in the borough. But we want to be developing a really comprehensive set of actions to tackle empty homes in every way we can, where we come up against obstacles in terms of CPO powers, resources available, powers to increase council tax, you name it. We want to develop those ideas and work with whoever we can to make sure we can maximise the supply of affordable housing in the borough.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Will you just quickly clarify what CPO is, please?
So sorry, forgive me. So that's a compulsory purchase order. So that's the ability that councils, the local authorities have to legally essentially purchase a home against when you have an unwilling seller. So those are the powers that we campaign on, certainly in relation to land, where we wanted to change the land compensation code to secure more affordable land for affordable housing. But it's also the main obstacle we have when it comes to dealing with the owners of long-term empty homes in trying to bring their homes back into use when they're not prepared to work with the council to invest in them and bring them back into circulation.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you very much. So, Will McMahon, Action on Empty Homes.
Hi everybody. Thanks for the invite to speak today. It's really appreciated. I'm director of Action on Empty Homes, and basically we are a national campaign that's focused on ensuring that empty homes are brought back into use. I want to start by quoting a homeless bloke called Baruch, who we spoke to recently, who lives in London, and he said, "There isn't a shortage of empty homes in London. Almost every street has empty houses. People are playing a power game with housing. It's just a game for some people. It's like London's having a war with itself and people are suffering." And I thought that was quite an interesting thing for him to say, and quite an interesting way to pose it. And we're kind of with him in the sense that there are empty homes across the country, almost on every street actually. They're of different types. What worries me today is I was just reflecting on the figures, the most recent government data. And there are now something like 270,000 long-term empty homes across England, which is a huge amount. And you can put that next to the 100,000 people living in temporary accommodation. And that gives you some size of the problem in terms of temporary accommodation and the amount of property that might be available. But I also want to add on a couple of other figures. There are 260,000 second homes in the country, and there are 130,000 Airbnb properties in the country. So if you're looking at bring together the empty homes, the Airbnb and the second homes, you've got 660,000 houses which have no permanent resident, which is a phenomenal figure when you set it against 100,000 in temporary accommodation. And you look at those two figures and you think something has gone badly wrong here. So we want changes in national policy. We want, in particular, the government to put resources in, but also we think it's really important that local communities have a central say in what happens in terms of the empty homes problem and what happens in terms of underutilisation of housing across the country. And our starting point, alongside communities and alongside the numbers, is a concern we have is about the financialisation of housing, because over the last generation, as a country, we've been kind of educated to stop thinking about housing as a social good that exists in communities and to start thinking about housing as a financial asset that we can make money out of. And one of the things we're looking for is a complete reversal of that thinking. It'd be much better to think of homes as social goods rather than investment assets.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's an English campaign for Action on Empty Homes. Yep. So we're now going to the Welsh Shadow Minister for Local Government, Housing and Communities, Mark Isherwood. Thank you very, very much for joining us. If you'd please introduce yourself and explain your position on empty homes.
Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for that introduction. You explained who I am. I've been a member of what was known as the Welsh Assembly, now the Welsh Parliament, since 2003, just coming to the end of my fourth term, our fifth term since devolution, and I've held the housing brief for 14 of those 18 years. Prior to that, I worked for a building society, area manager in North Wales, provided not only finance of residential housing and low-cost home ownership programs and schemes, but also for RSLs, housing associations. And I was also on the board of a Merseyside housing association for 12 years prior to that, and had lots of experience there on inner city issues and the change to the linkage of housing per se to sustainable community regeneration, working with the people in the communities. Now, Rhiannon told me that she contacted me to attend this roundtable meeting after seeing an article written, "Help Bring Empty Properties Back into Use," which had followed my speech in the December 2019 debate in the Welsh Parliament on our Equality, Local Government and Communities Committee report on empty properties. The Equality, Local Government Communities Committee is equivalent to a select committee in Westminster for England. We call them scrutiny committees, but they have oversight within the Parliament of government and legislation in these areas. As a member of the committee, I said that many owners don't wish to see their properties lying idle and should be supported to bring them back into use. As our report stated then, around 27,000 private sector homes in Wales had been empty for more than 6 months at that time. And this is in a population of just over 3 million. We heard from witnesses in committee that in England, multiple authorities will adopt a regional partnership model, appointing an officer between them to share costs and resources, and that having an empty homes officer is critical, as having a corporate strategic approach helps tackle huge delays and barriers. We heard that longer term funding was needed for the schemes in Wales. We also heard that in Scotland, there'd been a simplified fitness housing standard adopted, and that effective community-led approaches played a key part because people felt involved and had a real say in how homes are brought back into use. I stated that as a former Housing Association voluntary board member, I welcomed the Welsh Government's recognition that housing associations played a key part in bringing empty properties into use, but we needed to see evidence that they've been genuinely involved by Welsh Government and local authorities. I also stated that having a national action plan in place, adopting genuinely community-based approaches, accountability measures, and establishing a source of legal expertise for empty property teams to access would be critical. As the committee report stated, this should include work to understand the impact that having a specific officer with responsibility for empty properties can make, and that training for local authority officers and members on the enforcement options available will be essential, as will be the provision of flexible funding solutions sensitive to local needs and that also assist property owners. You'll appreciate in Wales we have different housing legislation and different enforcement measures. As our report also stated, we note the clear evidence from stakeholders that having a dedicated empty property officer in post can make a significant difference to a local authority's capacity and ability to tackle the issues. Simply providing a reactive service that responds to complaints, we said, does not address the root cause of why a property is empty. Adding, whilst not all local authorities would necessarily require this to be a full-time role, we believe that such a post can bring more focus to the work and coordinate the various activities being undertaken across the authority. As I also noted 8 years previously in the Welsh Parliament, of the 954 properties brought back into use in Wales in 2010-11, 154 were in Denbighshire alone before the Welsh Government's Housing into Home scheme was launched. Denbighshire had been recognised as the top performer in England and Wales for bringing empty properties back into use. And as their empty homes officer told me, they had identified empty homes and brought them back into use, recognising that it costs an owner money to leave a home empty, and that effective empty home strategies seek to work in the first instance with owners, developing services to help them overcome the hurdles they face. I appreciate London is a different market, and perhaps the mix of owners may be different, but in Wales, the predominant, roughly 90% of owners only have 1 or 2 properties on which they rely on for their average incomes.
Okay.
The Welsh Government launched the Housing into Home scheme in April 2012 to help tackle the substantial numbers of empty homes in Wales, supported by then a 20 million recyclable loan fund, providing interest-free loans available to individuals, charities, companies and businesses, with a maximum amount per property, which was then 25,000, having to be paid back within 2 or 3 years, depending on whether the property was sold or let. And I'll finally mention the 20.
Mark, I don't want to give you all of your answers away. Sorry, Mark, I don't want you to give all of your answers away. We've got 3 questions, which hopefully some of the rest of your introduction can fall into. Thank you very much for giving us such an insight into your position. But yeah, you will have an opportunity to hopefully answer the other questions. Can I please bring in Parts? Do you mind introducing yourself and explaining your position on empty homes? Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Thanks, Rhiannon, and yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm Harps. I'm the planning solicitor and caseworker at Southwark Law Centre. Southwark Law Centre is a charity that's been present in the borough since the 1970s. And we also provide housing advice, employment advice, immigration advice, and welfare benefits advice. And we're part of the Law Centre's network that has a number of sort of registered charities that provide legal advice. But I'm the only sort of planning advisor present in any of those organisations. So it's kind of a bold initiative to try and get out this really important advice on regeneration and local planning, as well as individual planning applications in a borough where there's a lot of change. So for me, empty homes represent a failure in our system on multiple levels. I think I see it as a failure to address the increased financialisation of housing and it having moved in the previous decades to a home being seen as an investment rather than a place you derive shelter and protection from, as well as a failure to provide social housing and that's the building and provision of it, to see housing in terms of its use to people and society. And the importance of this has obviously been brought out in the pandemic, where we've been told to stay at home. Not everybody has a home or a safe home that can protect them from the virus. I have to be fairly Southwark based here because this is the borough where I work and live. And it's obviously an inner city sort of London borough. And the scale of the failure was brought home to me when I started working at Southwark Law Centre shortly before Actions on Empty Homes released a report with some data just before the 2019 general election, which showed that Southwark had the largest amount of empty homes of any London borough. So in this area, there's really been a crisis of demolishing council homes and then building homes that no one can afford. And it's also the case that a policy was actively pursued of social cleansing, but as I see it, it could not proceed in the same way due to the impact of the economic downturn in 2008, which meant that social cleansing led to empty homes rather than more affluent neighbourhoods, as was stated to be the aim of the regeneration in the Elephant and Castle Master Plan, which was around the 2004 period. Southwark is still doing badly, and I have to say thank you to Action on Empty Homes for really distilling a lot of data in this regard and presenting it to us in a readable format. Hopefully we can talk a bit more about that later. During the past year, the number of empty homes has increased, and Southwark Defend Council Housing has held demonstrations to try and highlight this issue on new developments where there's a large amount of empty homes, but there used to be council housing, one being Elephant Park in Elephant and Castle, and one being Peckham Place in Peckham, and also at a long-term empty building in Rotherhithe. I think I've thought over the course of the pandemic, when I look out at Elephant Park, which replaced the Haygate estate, as well as clapping for our brilliant healthcare workers, we should also really be condemning the system that's been created that robs our public services and our public service workers and everybody of the money they need to keep us alive, but also has taken away land from us and the possibility of living in a home we can afford. So I'm looking forward to speaking about how we might be able to address that.
Thank you very much, Arts, and to all the speakers. We'll now move on to the questions. So we have 3 questions taking us to 4 o'clock, and then we'll open to a Q&A. Mark Isherwood is only with us until 4 o'clock, so hopefully we manage to get the rest of his introduction and so he can explain fully the position on empty homes. So the first question is, how can empty homes be prevented in the long term? How can owners be persuaded not to leave a home empty? So we'll start with, we'll go in the same order. Councillor Leo Pollak, do you mind coming in?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a number of things that, well, I'm going to reserve some of my what can the council do questions for question number 2, because so I've split up some of my answers here. I think the things that would create genuine long-term change and stop this kind of blight of empty homes, and Harps is certainly right to draw attention to the fact that there are too many empty homes in Southwark. And one of the ones that the campaigners were campaigning at Peckham Place, I went to join that campaign because it was a block Notting Hill built that we had offered construction cost plus a little bit extra to get back as council housing. But I think Notting Hill, like many kind of housing associations and developers, are caught in a housing system where they have to cross-subsidise, they have to sell homes privately to have their sums add up, and they're operating increasingly in a kind of commercialised housing investment environment, and that's part of what we're trying to sort of create a countervailing pressure against. Things that would make a real difference, and it's interesting to hear Mark as a Tory representative sort of speak so kind of passionately on the need to create to tackle empty homes, and there's scope for a cross-party consensus here. But the things that nationally that would help would be a kind of unlimited ability to apply a council tax premium on empty homes. At the minute, we applied the maximum council tax premium of 300% for homes that have been empty and unfurnished for over 2 years. If that figure could be significantly higher, we wouldn't have, I think, the problem that we've got in Southwark. I talk about compulsory purchase because it's essential. If the compulsory purchase process was much simpler, quicker and cheaper, I think many home owners would make sure their homes are used. It's all about the threat of what levers local and national government can apply, and it's been generally very weak powers ever since the 1960s. I think also it would be helpful for planning powers to be strengthened in this regard. At the minute, we can't require developers in a planning agreement to have their homes properly occupied within a given period of time. So, I'd love to see if a home is empty for any more than, say, 6 months after full practical completion and handover, then they should revert back to the local authority to offer as affordable housing. That would make a huge difference here in Southwark. There's so many empty homes that have been completed, particularly during the pandemic. We'd love to position ourselves as a buyer of last resort or even first resort to build to increase the overall stock of council housing. So those are a few of the things that could help. I'll leave some of my kind of what can we do locally answers to the second question.
Thank you very much. Will, do you mind coming in? So how can empty homes be prevented in the long term? How can owners be persuaded not to leave a home empty? I'll just check. Sorry, everyone just wait for one moment.
Okay, did I start again? Okay, so I think there's two aspects to prevention, really. One is we've got to stop building the wrong kind of housing across the country, particularly in the metropolitan areas. I mean, flats are being built at a very, very rapid pace based on wealth investment, and not necessarily all of them for people to actually live in them full time. So we've got to stop allowing those kind of buildings to be thrown up because a lot of them are going to be Airbnb, a lot of them are going to be buy to leave, a lot of them are going to be second homes and just basically wealth investments. And we have to stop that, because every time you build a block like that, you're gobbling up some land on which you could build housing that could be affordable. And I mean genuinely affordable for people that need it. Secondly, I think, just to return to a point that others have touched on, which is we need a cultural shift away from seeing housing as investment towards seeing it as a social good. And we need a national conversation about that, about how we got into this position where people just think in terms of housing as investment as a society. We need to challenge that. In terms of owners, I mean, it really depends, because there are two sorts of owners. You know, there are people who genuinely need support of the local authority. There's no doubt about it. There's a whole series of needs that people have, and local authority and government can get behind them. I mean, personally, just down the road from me, there is a flat that has been empty for, I think, about 8 years. And the reason it's been empty is because the person occupying the flat lived there with his parents died, and that gave him quite long-term mental health problems, and he just didn't want to sell the flat. Yeah, so that's one kind. On the other end of it, you've got people who are investing for reasons of profit, and they keep it empty as a safety deposit box. So it depends on which kind of investment, which kind of person you're looking at, and each require, I think, different solutions. But crucially, community leadership. You know, there's a lot of intelligence in local communities about what's happening in their community and how they can put it right. And I think local authorities and government allowing and encouraging community leadership with the right resource can actually get to grips with a lot of these problems.
Thank you very much. Mark Isherwood, would you please come in?
Thank you. Just no criticism, but it's Isherwood. It's a Welsh Lancashire name, but it's like Sherwood Forest with an I at the beginning as I. But I digress. Yeah, Wales obviously, as I said, is a different market. We have our hotspots and speculation, but really only in predominantly in the small number of very high demand holiday areas where there's demand for second homes. generally in Wales, house prices in many parts are quite depressed, although particularly in the border areas and the big cities, that's not the case. A lot of our empty properties are owned by accidental owners. And I'm sure that's the case with some of your experience. So people who might have inherited them. Very few of them, as I say, are financiers or speculators building capital. So I mentioned the helping hand approach, which has been most effective where it's been applied, finding that most owners of empty properties actually don't want them to be sitting empty and wasted. They want to bring them back into use and welcome a local authority offering to assist them in doing that. It helps that the Welsh Government has a programme supported by all parties, the Housing to Home scheme, but as indicated, it's not been problem-free. Hence our committee inquiry and update on that. We identified many particular needs there, even when the will exists, such as the need for adequate staffing resources, advice, guidance and training for staff. In Wales, I think the enforcement requirements are even more complex than they are for yourselves, which deters local authorities, particularly cash-strapped local authorities, from taking action when a big stick is required rather than the carrot. And that's been, as I mentioned, assisted where local authorities have, even part-time or shared, an empty homes officer whose job is to identify the properties, initially try to engage positively with the owners, and then if that doesn't work, going back to the big stick, engaging with their enforcement teams to bring the properties back to use. Where support is provided through public sector, most of those properties would, at least for a minimum period, perhaps 5 years, then be managed by social landlords to ensure immediate need is met. To put this in context, Wales, according to Cllr, Chartered Institute of Housing, Community Housing Cymru, which is our housing fed, has somewhere between 60 and 70,000 people, households on waiting lists at the moment. So proportionately, that's very high given the population. And those organisations describe Wales as having a housing supply crisis. So much of what you're saying about shortage, particularly in affordable social housing, is very much replicated in Wales. And we're working with similar problems, although we don't have, by and large, the issue you're highlighting with speculative property owners holding back on development. More often it's people who just need a bit of help. But clearly there is some example, or are some examples of that type in certain areas.
Thank you very much. And Harpreet, will you please come in?
Yeah, it is interesting hearing about Wales, and I know we can't go into the sort of topic of rebalancing sort of the economy and it sort of in England and Wales separately, but yeah, again, it's going to be quite London focused for me, although less on how owners can be persuaded not to leave a home empty. I think of it more in terms of the system and the sort of big ideas about clamping down on sort of buying to let and how, you know, sort of landlords with a huge scale of property, also in terms of addressing financialisation of housing, clamping down on foreign investment in property, as Will mentioned. So people who are just seeing the property as investment only and not having any incentive to sort of even put it into use during that life of an investment. And yeah, really just to address you know, the crisis of housing as well, just building social homes. That's the solution, I think, there in the area that I live in, but obviously across the country it's really tragic, the situation that we're in, as an example, as we've mentioned, Peckham Place, which is this development in Peckham, where I think once stood 213 social homes, and now there are none. And so we really need to clamp down in all these loopholes that developers and individuals can seek. I mean, in that case, Notting Hill Housing flipped the social homes that they said they were going to provide, which didn't comply with Southwark's policy at the time the application was approved. But even then there was a commitment to providing some social homes, but they were flipped to affordable homes. And affordable homes can be up to 80% of market rent. And in an area like Southwark, that is so unaffordable. So I really would love to see some bold moves to just really clamp down on this and make it unlawful. And the way I see it in Peckham Place is that those homes are empty because they are so unaffordable. I think a one-bedroom flat is upwards of £450,000. That might be the cheapest flat you could get in that development. So it really is crazy, and that might be for like a 38 square foot property.
Thank you very much, Harpreet. Okay, we'll now move on to the second question. The second question is, what can the Welsh Government do / UK Government do to restrict the number of empty homes? What do you think the local government should do? So if we'll go in the same order, and Councillor Pollak, if you'd start.
Sure. Where to start? We're trying to bring out a really big list of actions that the local government can pursue to try and tackle empty homes. I think the first thing really to pick on what Will was talking about, it's absolutely essential to tap into community intelligence. People know where empty homes are. They particularly know when it blights their neighbourhood, when it attracts antisocial behaviour. So one thing we're looking to do is basically improving the data that we have on empty homes and creating a really simple monitoring and alerting tool, so residents can tell us where they think there's an empty home and we can investigate it quickly. And the other bit as well, you know, like kind of Mark referenced in different local authorities in Wales, we have empty homes officers, but they are limited by the resources and levers that they have they can make use of. So we want to kind of empower our empty homes officers by ensuring that they've got access to proper funds. So one thing a council can do is set up a rolling CPO fund, and that's something that we are looking to do as part of our empty homes action plan that will hopefully bring a lot more empty homes back into use, as well as make it easier to use empty homes management orders. They're quite kind of long-winded processes that take several years to bring homes back into circulation, but I think if owners can see that we're doing this with a concerted effort, that will hopefully influence their behaviour. Another thing that councils can do is obviously work with owners of homes. As Will said, there's a lot of accidental landlords out there, so offering a range of grants and loans to help bring their homes back into use. Since we began doing that, we've brought over 2,000 homes back into use, but we still have this kind of growing problem of long-term empty housing in the borough. One other thing also is that you can set up a lettings agency. We've done this in Southwark, so we regularly write letters to the owner of every long-term empty home saying, let us bring your home back into use. We'll guarantee you a rent that's no higher than the local housing allowance level in the area. We'll give you a really good insurance coverage, repairs coverage. We'll make sure that home is returned back to you when it is returned in better condition than we found it. And this has brought, you know, several dozen homes into use that we've been able to house homeless residents in, but we want to really take that to a whole new level. And part of how we might be doing that as well is that we'll be rolling out a new private rented sector licensing scheme in the borough with a differentiated fee, so a much higher fee for people who are renting their properties and not meeting the kind of standards of security, affordability, responsive repairs, just being a good landlord. But we'll have no fee at all for those landlords who want to make their homes available through the council's lettings agency to homeless households and to key workers. So we're hoping that push, it's a bit of an experiment, but we're hoping that push will bring a lot more empty homes back into use as affordable housing specifically. And the final thing that councils can do, and that we do is always try and flip tenure from unaffordable to affordable. And obviously with the market, the housing market plateauing in the way that it has in recent years, and the kind of uncertainty created around the pandemic, we've been really proactive in approaching housing associations and developers, including the housing association that had control over the estate Harps was talking about, to bring a lot more of those homes back into use as social housing. And we've done that at scale. We've brought hundreds of homes that were marked as for private sale or for shared ownership into use as social rent council housing. So I think councils positioning themselves to do that makes a big difference. And obviously we get lots of approaches from builders across the borough with a view to trying to sell their homes, but often at over the top prices. But of course, in order to really bring this, do this at proper scale, we need government funding to make sure that those homes can come into use as genuinely affordable. We need unlimited powers around what level of council tax premium we apply on empty homes. We need those CPO powers, compulsory purchase that is simpler, quicker and cheaper. We also need planning powers that allow us to make sure that when a developer completes their homes, if they're unoccupied for, say more than 6 months, that they come back to the use of the local authority to let out as affordable housing. So those are a few of the ideas that we're putting forward as part of our Empty Homes Action Plan. A lot of that is lobbying and campaigning work. We're keen to work with anybody, Action on Empty Homes, SGTO, you name it, to develop those lobbying lines and create the strongest voice possible coming out of Southwark.
Okay, thank you very much. And Leo, there's lots of questions around that, which is exciting to ask. So if I could please bring in Will.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what's just been said, I agree with actually. What was really pleasing to hear was the word strategy, because that's really what's required at a local authority level, and the kind of strategy that isn't written and put on a shelf, but one that is really, really followed through, because many local authorities have got strategies, but they don't implement them. Now, obviously, there are issues around resourcing and what's happened to local government over the last period in terms of the reduction of resources that local government has, and that has to be taken seriously. But what is crucial, I agree, is that the government gets behind a renovation strategy. Now, the coalition government actually did this. When it first came into power, it set up an empty homes programme, £200 million worth, and it renovated 10,000 homes. Yeah, and brought, for about an average of 20,000, it brought these homes back into use. And it's not often you get a social policy where you can say we put the money in and the outcome was good, and we're not going to do it again. Yeah, the government should do that again. I mean, it's such an obvious thing to do because everybody knows it works. So they should celebrate the success of the coalition policy and just repeat it on a bigger scale. I mean, it'd be a very good thing to do. There's also the issue around, I think, data. Now, it's not really the data that we have around empty homes and second homes and Airbnb is not really clear. It's a bit like looking through a bathroom window. It's a bit you kind of get a picture of what's going on, but you can't quite see the data properly. And that's because there's no real rigorous collection of the data at a national level. And there's no real rigorous reporting of the data by individual owners. So you can basically return your form saying, this is how my house is being used, and that's taken as real. And one of the ways around this, we think, is it's really important to have a national register of landlords and beneficial owners. So you know who the landlord is and you know who's going to profit from that person being the landlord. And it's a really straightforward demand, which would actually clarify what's going on with lots and lots of underutilized properties across the country. And it's a really important thing to do. And we also need government to look at this definition of second home, because you can own 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 second homes. Yeah, there's no such thing as a third home in the legislation. So that needs to be looked at. And when people talk about second homes and the underutilization of them, people think of Wales and holiday homes and all that kind of thing. But actually, there are places across England where there are thousands of second homes, which are clearly not holiday homes. I mean, I have been to and loved Bradford. Yeah? It's a very nice place, but there are 5,000 second homes in Bradford. That makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, there's investment properties, so that category really needs to be looked at. And another step that can be taken in terms of empty homes is how it slides into Airbnb, and how Airbnb properties can suddenly be re-registered as second homes. So we've got to get a grip of Airbnb. Whole house Airbnb is something that we have to really challenge quite strongly. Now, from a community level, if you talk to people in the community about what the housing in their area is being used for, you can say, well, these many second homes, these many long-term empty homes, these many Airbnb homes. At a very local level, you can see the nature of the problem. And so we can do something about it, but the government has really, to be honest, got to pull its finger out on it, because there is a solution, because they've done it before.
Thank you very much. Mark, can I please bring you in?
Yes, thank you. Well, I mentioned it briefly in my preamble, the need for local government, if necessary in smaller authorities working with others, to develop a strategic approach to tackle delays and barriers. Because we heard reference to EDMOs, empty dwelling management orders. Of course, there's the whole housing health and safety rating system, and hazards, and then a range of different enforcement actions that could be taken where hazard ones are identified. But certainly in Wales, there's been a very low rate of enforcement action at any level under those pieces of all those powers under the 2004 Housing Act. So how do we address that? And that does need, certainly in the Welsh context, and I presume it's the case in much of England, better training, better expertise, better legal advice and support, and more streamlined processes. And if you ever look at our committee report, we do evidence or reference evidence received from some authorities in England, or about certain authorities in England, where despite the complexity of the issues, they've found ways of streamlining this to make it more easy for them to apply at lower cost and with better use of resource. I'll scribble down some of the points made, or broader than that. Local authorities, in my view, need to be working in partnership as strategic housing providers with the RSLs, utilising the resource available to maximise the social and affordable supply, rather than wanting to own everything themselves, and also with the private rented sector. And I suspect you've had the same experiences we have over private rented sector access agencies. It's a decade since the National Landlords Association, as it then was, established with the voluntary sector a social enterprise to act as a social letting agency in North Wales, based in Dolgellau. And that wasn't just providing homes for people that were in the private rented sector, but it was providing them to the people that the private landlords least wanted to home. People who had been on the streets, people recovering from addictions, people who'd been released from prison, and so on. But giving safeguards to the landlords, and also providing a broad spectrum of housing-related support appropriate to the needs of the individual. And that worked very well when we looked at this in committee 10 years ago, with very few tenancies failing. However, most local authorities in Wales instead set up private rented sector access agencies. So in order to supplement their limited supply of available social homes, they were referring applicants to this broader supply through approved properties and approved tenants in their own agencies, but didn't have the additional social letting agency support for landlords and tenants that was so key to making this work. So I've always supported the broader, social enterprise, social letting agency approach, rather than simply a local authority PRS access agency. Counter-tax premiums were mentioned. In Wales, it kicks in after a premium of to 200%, kicks in after 1 year. But it's important, as in Scotland, that there are exclusions, for example, probate and bereavement, where people don't necessarily have any spare resource, they're not wealthy, and the reason the property is sitting empty is often quite tragic. So we have to be aware of sensitivities there. In Wales, unlike England, the Help to Buy scheme doesn't include empty properties or properties needing renovation, so we want to extend it to include that. Issues, I had a reference to land. In Wales, all the parties support, and to its credit, the Welsh Government is seeking to identify and encourage public bodies to identify land that can be made available for the development of social and affordable housing. Again, with a mixed response, because local authorities and public sector are reluctant to let land go at sub-market prices. But where there's community benefit, they can do so. And we always argue there's a social benefit and a wider savings to the public purse if they do so. I mentioned private rented sector licensing. Oh no, private rented sector licensing schemes. We already have that in Wales. We have the Renting Homes Wales Act. Prior to that, the Housing Wales Act. We have a scheme where every private sector landlord has to register, undergo training, and pay a fee. And if they're also managing the tenancy, they must be licensed, or otherwise the letting agency must be licensed. The problem there is, whereas the Rent Smart Wales, which oversees this, is relatively efficient at making landlords register, although they spend a lot of time chasing down those who most need to and are least willing to do so, there's been tiny amount of enforcement action. And the purpose surely is to improve the quality and supply of homes to tenants. So there's no point in having a scheme if the resource and expertise to enforce isn't aligned to that, especially where in Wales currently still enforcement of property standards and fitness is still with the local authorities, whereas enforcement of licensing and registration lies with a separate body. So again, the complexity we managed to incorporate into this scheme with a population of 3 million is incredible. In Scotland, as you might know, in 2006, they introduced a licensing scheme, which they effectively abandoned as a mandatory requirement in 2010, because their equivalent of Rent Smart Wales and their local authorities were spending all their time getting people to register rather than taking enforcement action, which surely must be the priority. And finally, with second homes, we have a big issue which has been highlighted, particularly in holiday hotspots, some places like Pengley and the Clean Peninsula in North Wales, where some of you might have been on holiday, but other hotspots where second homes are registered as businesses eligible for small business rates relief. Yeah. But that's not a simple process, because it's overseen by the Valuation Office Agency, and the Welsh Government sets the criteria they must meet in order to be registered as a business. So the property must be available to let at least 140 days a year and be rented out for at least 70 days a year to qualify. You may want to set a bar higher or lower, but it's not simply a case of second homes sitting there, fortunately claiming to be second homes, because there is an incentive to register for small business rates relief, but also a benchmark above which they must rise if they're going to be eligible.
Thank you very much, Mark. Will you just very quickly confirm what PRS and RSL stand for? So I think PRS is private rented sector.
Yes.
And RSL?
Registered social landlords, housing associations predominantly.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just, Harps, can I bring you in? Can I bring you in? Thank you.
Oh, a few things have been mentioned, I would say, so I'll try to be quick, but things that haven't been mentioned are, as I see it, things that would address the distorted market in housing. So I would love the UK government to commit to building more social homes, and in places where there's high renting costs, introduce rent caps. I'd like to see a clamping down on foreign purchasers looking for investment assets, financial disincentives, and closing down of tax avoidance loopholes. Compulsory purchase orders have been mentioned. I think this might touch on the next question, but I'm quite interested to hear what the other speakers would say about some of the government initiatives such as shared ownership and Help to Buy, and how they've distorted things. And I think that they're terrible policies and should be abandoned. And also, what else? Yeah, I think that's, local government. Yeah, it would be great if Leo was talking about bringing a report in to deal with preventing empty homes sort of 20 years ago in Southwark, but we are where we are, so it would be really great to see that. I know other local authorities in London have brought one in. I read one for Haringey, and it's talking about using compulsory purchase orders and monitoring more, and also Islington. One thing that he didn't mention also, and again, this is a Southwark example, but it is applicable to other local authorities, is the monitoring of affordable housing when it's flipped in tenure. That data being transparent. We've been told a number of times in Southwark that that there is monitoring going on, but we've never seen the results of it. And I think it's a requirement. So really, going back to Will's point about data, I'd like to see sort of strict transparency rules on local authorities to be detailing on their websites where new development is coming forward, what tenure it is, and what was agreed in sort of the planning stage, and then what has transpired in the actual build stage, and then when it's finalised.
Thank you very much, Harps. Okay, now moving on to the third and final question. What role should housing associations play in solving the empty home crisis? So we start with Leo.
I'm just enjoying Harps's ruining the fact that I wasn't bringing this report forward 20 years ago. I don't think it would have been legal for me to be a councillor 20 years ago, but I'm sorry, Harps, for what I was doing when I was a teenager. So housing associations, I mean, they've got to be key partners in this effort, haven't they? They've got to not have any empty homes of their own. So they've got to have really strict void turnaround targets. They are also, you know, they have additional commercial freedoms than a council might have. So I'd be keen for them to obviously be proactively seeking out empty homes for purchase and repurposing as affordable housing in our borough. But I think the key thing for housing associations is that nearly all of them, except for a few that were set up very recently, have a social mission at their heart. You know, it's in their articles of association that they have to be maximising the amount of affordable homes that they bring forward, and that their investment decisions have to lead in that direction. So I would say Harps has mentioned Peckham Place. There are some social homes actually on Peckham Place, and obviously we made an offer that was the full development cost and return of any land receipt to a housing association, Notting Hill Genesis, plus a little bit extra that wasn't accepted because they were considering our offer against another offer from a subsidiary of Deutsche Bank, which is really frustrating. So you want to see housing associations, the main thing I would sort of implore them to do is to stick to their social mission when they've got investment decisions to make like that, to be assessing them not just against the bottom line, but against the bottom line of what they're all about, which is building strong communities and bringing forward affordable housing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Will, if I can bring you in?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that, but I think that you know, housing associations have changed so much over the last 20 years. I mean, just big businesses. And I'm doing work with Peabody on the community plan for Holloway, and we are just dealing with a very big business. And you get the sense that the social mission side of it has largely disappeared for the big organisations, and there's a big gap there, actually, a big gap in provision, really, organisations that could provide affordable housing. So that they need to think about what they're doing as organisations. I think they need to start investing in empty homes and refurbishing empty homes. Yeah, that would be a really good thing for them to do. And when they dispose of properties, they shouldn't be disposing of them into the private sector. They just should not be doing that. They should be getting them back into low cost housing through councils. They should be ensuring that people can have a genuinely affordable place to live in if they're going to dispose of a property. And the other thing they need to do is really look carefully and liaise carefully with local authorities to make sure that they're not kind of introducing managed decline in neighbourhoods by withdrawing. There needs to be better collaboration there. So there is quite a lot that housing associations can do. I really have my doubts about whether they're going to do it, because I think that they're dominated by the bottom line, and I think there needs to be a conversation about that and how that kind of model has been hollowed out in the last 20 to 30 years. Some of these companies could be quoted on the stock market. They're so large, you know, and we need to address that problem, really.
Thank you very much. Mark, can you please come in?
Thank you. Yes, I mentioned I was on the board of a housing association for 12 years in Merseyside. In the 80s, a lot of the work, it was a medium-sized association. We very much had a community ethic. It was about the people and the quality of the housing. But in the 80s, a lot of the government funding, the social housing grant, was available for regeneration. So a lot of the work my association have done in the 80s has been focused on bringing back into use derelict streets often, or former apartment blocks, or even stores or office buildings into residential use. By the 90s, that was turning back to new development. But there the focus had changed, certainly on Merseyside, which pioneered the sustainable community regeneration model. It was Mr. Kemp, was it? He's still on the council, a housing entrepreneur, who told the associations on Merseyside that if they still wanted to get council support for social housing grants and proposed schemes, they had to bid for a zone in the city and take responsibility not just for the bricks and mortar, but for the broader sustainable community regeneration, skills, training, access to employment, public services, transport, and so on, working with the council. And in Wales, although well behind, certainly Merseyside, in developing that agenda, incorporated it into the rollout of its Welsh Housing Quality Standard, working with community, Chartered Institute of Housing, to introduce the Welsh Housing Quality Standard Plus model, which is more about co-production, about designing and delivering services with communities, and unlocking the strengths that people have within those communities to mutual benefit. In Wales, I work very closely with Community Housing Cllr, which is the umbrella body. They and other parts of the sector are all calling for a 20,000 new social home within one Welsh parliamentary term 5-year target, which we fully support. The Welsh Government has a 20,000 target, but it includes all affordable housing, including intermediate rent and low cost of ownership, rent to buy, etc. So, and only a small proportion of that is actually social rent. So we believe not only do we need that 20,000 new social home delivery and 40,000 over 10 years, but that's in addition to broader low cost of ownership programs to support those people who aspire to own their own properties if they're able to. Reference to big businesses was made, and RSLs becoming big businesses. There's pressure, including in Wales, and I'm not, well, we obviously have a Labour government, but I'm not going into the party politics, because we've got nearly 40 developing associations, 11 of which are stock transfer, and the Welsh government, I think, wants to see that streamlined, have a smaller number of bigger associations. But then that creates corporatism. It creates, even in non-profit bodies, the greater focus on the business than on the social mission. So I'm not somebody who always believes that big is beautiful or more efficient or more effective, although there are times when a failing organisation has to be bailed out. I think I've covered the main points I wish to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Harps, will you please come in, and then we'll go to the open section. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, I didn't mean to personalise things there with Leo Pollak. He knows I meant his predecessors, 15 or so predecessors back. But I don't. It's interesting because I'm like, I think just about a millennial, and having grown up in a city like London, I have never really looked at housing associations as different to developers. But then obviously when you look in the history, you see that that isn't meant to be the case. And through my work, I've sort of seen how they operate, as well as mentioned on that, very much on that model. So I want to see local authorities building en masse council housing. I'd be really interested to hear what people on the call think the role of housing associations might be in supporting that, but kind of that's what I'm looking to see. So yeah, and it really troubles me that housing associations get lots of subsidies from the government, like I mentioned with shared ownership and Help to Buy. So perhaps we could have a conversation about that as well.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for making your comments. It will now go to a more open session. Mark, if you're not able to stay with us, of course, we understand.
I'll stay to 15:15, and then I will have to go.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Thank you. So Michael has a comment / suggestion proposal. Can you please come in, Michael, and introduce yourself a bit?
Thank you very much. I was late at the beginning of the meeting. I'm sorry about that. My name is Michael Edwards. I'm from a network in London called Just Space, which mainly campaigns on planning issues, but of course that includes a lot of housing. I wanted to mention something which we've written to various authorities about. We've written to City Hall in London and to the Government Statistical Service, but without any tangible results. And it's the following, that 20, 30 years ago, the data about housing, tenure, rents and so on was pretty transparent. You knew that if a council built homes, they would be rented out on secure tenancies at council rents, which was set by more or less national policy. You knew that if a housing association built homes, they would be rented out on different kinds of leases, a bit less secure, at rents which were at least known about in the public domain. And you knew also that if a private builder built houses, they would be sold freehold or leasehold on the open market to people buying them with cash or mortgages. So there was a pretty clear set of data which was easy to interpret about developers and development and the subsequent life of the houses and how they were occupied. That's completely fallen to pieces now. Each type of developer now can build homes to dispose at any of these tenure forms. Councils can build to sell, councils can build to rent at all sorts of different rents or for part by part rent and so on. And it's possible for owners of housing to change the lease status and change the rent levels, as the councillor just said, Leo Pollak said, during the life of the building. In our view, it's absolutely essential that government takes the necessary steps and the statistical service takes the necessary steps to make sure that we have good, up-to-date data nationally and for small areas about the housing that gets built and the tenure and rent levels which apply to it after it's completed and entered into its long life of use, and that's maintained up to date. So this is quite a big demand, quite a big ask, but I think it's really important for policymakers, for campaigners, for groups like yours, for groups like ours, for everybody concerned with the whole housing business. And indeed should be of enormous interest to the Treasury, keep shelling out public money, but they have no way of knowing whether it's successful or not because the data just doesn't exist. So any support we could get for this kind of campaign from your group would be really welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So would it be for local or national government to implement that?
Well, our view is that national government or the statistical service should take responsibility for it so that it's systematic, at least across England and hopefully across the whole UK. But then, as with any kind of national statistics collecting, it depends on local authorities and others to contribute to it through the ordinary annual process of filling in administrative returns, doing surveys, requiring returns from housing associations and other bodies.
Okay, so Leo and Will, I think, might be able to comment on support for that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, monitoring of what housing is, what tenure of housing is consented and then delivered is absolutely critical. Otherwise, you know, it doesn't really make a difference what you secure in a planning permission. In Southwark, we've been developing an affordable housing monitoring tool that aims to track that progression of homes when they're consented and then delivered much more precisely than is the case kind of generally, not just in Southwark, but elsewhere. So yeah, I would agree with the gist of what Michael's saying there.
Yeah, no, I would as well. I think that's a nail on the head, really. I mean, we're very concerned about data collection, about the huge variances across local authorities about how the data is collected. I sometimes think that, you know, we're getting a very partial picture in terms of empty homes, long-term empty homes. There's no doubt about that. And it needs to be much more rigorous. And starting point might be, I know this is a London-centred comment, but for the GLA and councils in London to try and work out a mechanism by where we all agree a system, that would be a good starting point. We've been talking to the Stats Office about the very same thing, actually. How is it possible to know if you're supplying genuinely affordable housing if you don't know what's being built and how it's being used? I mean, it's just bonkers for a society like ours to be doing that, and we really need something done about it. And it's at a government level. Government needs to lead on this. There's no question about it. But we'd be completely behind that.
Thank you. And Harps, I think you might have a quick comment on that.
Oh, me?
Oh,
Yes,
no.
sir. Oh, so Harp, sorry.
No, but Mark, come in.
Oh, you're here. Yeah.
Oh, no, it was just about, yeah, monitoring. That is a requirement, I understood, and it was something that we found out through, well, actually 35% campaign in Southwark found out through a number of FOI requests that this monitoring wasn't being done. I agree that there needs to be resources put in councils to be able to do that in a time of very stretched resources, but this should have been being done and it isn't. And we've been told in Southwark for years that this tool is coming out and this process is going to happen. I mean, it's another thing that we just really actually can have and just aren't being given, and it is a requirement, and sort of hands are tied because we can't do it ourselves. Actually, we've taken just walking around the borough trying to work out what's been built and compared to what was approved in the planning application, because that's maybe more reliable than asking the council for data at the minute.
Okay, thank you very much. Mark, if you did have a comment to make, you're welcome to come in.
Yeah,
and Will, I've just been asked. Oh yeah, go on, Mark.
Very briefly, and unfortunately, I will have to leave you. Yeah, actually, in Wales, paradoxically, it's the National Residential Landlords Association that's leading a campaign for a Welsh housing survey, a more formalised, structured, and regularised Welsh housing survey, which we've not had in an effective form for a long time. As an opposition member, I rely on data and stats, and I always put data before dogma. And so when I first started 18 years ago, we had, as we heard, wonderfully accessible, easily understood data tables providing all this information. Now it's almost impossible to discern unless we write individually to every local authority and hope that most of them will respond if they've got the data themselves. So I fully support the principle of that, although clearly I'm talking in the context of Wales rather than than England. I mean, there are benefits to some of the issues you referred to at the beginning. So if, and in Wales, we haven't got the same freedoms that exist in certain parts of England to, for example, enable social landlords to cross-subsidise on road exception sites so that they can build some properties for social rent, some for intermediate rent, some for perhaps low cost of ownership or full market sale, and then use the income generated to build more social housing than they could otherwise have afforded. Similarly, there's been a lot of research, which actually started with a small housing association in North Wales 20 years ago, on the benefits of mixed tenure developments, small mixed tenure developments for real communities. So you get away with that terrible word ghettoisation, because you've got everybody living together in properties that from the street front look pretty much the same, some bigger or smaller, but you can't tell which are social, which are private, and which are in between. So there is some benefit socially in that mixing, alongside the opportunity to fund greater social development. But as you say, we need facts behind that rather than mere speculation.
Thank you.
And on that note, I have to wish you all best for everything. Take
Before
care.
you go, Mark, it's really refreshing to hear a Tory politician speak about housing in the way that you do. When Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he cleared out all the half-decent housing advisors. So you should go and work in Downing Street on housing.
Oh, I'd love to, but this has been my approach in Wales for 2 decades or more, and in the sector before that. So I'm just being consistent, I suppose. Unfortunately, some colleagues have diversified from what used to be a common position. I'm sure they'll come back again.
Diversified, very diplomatic.
Okay, thank you for your time. Well, thank you very much. We have a question from Andy. And Ben, I've got 3 stocked up questions. Thank you, Andy. Please come in.
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. So really good discussion. Yeah, I mean, good inviting Mark Isherwood. As Leo said, really interesting kind of contribution. I think big thing is that Mark was saying that in Wales they kind of try the kind of cooperative approach, and if that doesn't work, they get the big stick out. But it doesn't kind of feel like a big stick. It feels like a kind of soft pillow in terms of getting empty homes back. And I kind of question how long we've got the luxury. So I think the government themselves say, look, there needs to be 250,000 new homes built a year. Shelters say there needs to be kind of 90,000 new council houses built a year for the next 10 years. Mark was talking about, I think, 20,000 homes in Wales over 5 years. So all those kind of figures are massive. Okay, there's a writer, Danny Dorling, who's provocative, and what he said is that actually there's enough homes, there's enough bedrooms in the country if they were just kind of allocated more fairly to solve the housing crisis. So he kind of does the maths and said, look, you can solve the housing crisis if you just kind of allocated the existing homes more equally. I think given the scale of the housing crisis, you obviously need both. You need kind of equity for the existing housing and you need new homes built. So mine's really kind of a question to Harps, Will and Leo, how you kind of scale this up, because the soft pillow just kind of feels like too much of a luxury given the kind of housing crisis we've got.
Okay, so Leo, thank you, Mark.
I'm trying to interpret the question a little bit. How to scale up the supply of social...
Sorry, how to scale up enforcement on empty homes, Leo? So councils do really well, and you know, nationally we might get hundreds back, whereas actually we need to get thousands into use. So how do we get thousands of empty homes back into use in a reasonable amount of time is my question.
I mean, I don't ever want to pass back up to government and talk about funding, but it does fundamentally come down to that. We have an empty homes team that are made up of officers out of our asset management division who, you know, focus on aids and adaptations, to try and get empty homes back into proper use. We also have, obviously, in our housing solutions team, a big effort to procure homes in the private sector and lease them out to homeless families at affordable rents. And obviously there is a lot of proactive work that can be built upon on that front, not least some of the initiatives around having kind of staggered license fees that you set with your private rented sector license to really incentivise homeowners, and particularly homeowners of empty homes, to bring their homes forward. But the resource, it comes down to a simple resource issue. We are really stretched in Southwark. I've had to do a lot of persuading just to get officers to bring forward this empty homes action plan. They've done an amazing job to get it to where it is. But it comes down to the capacity that we've got and the actual return that you get from the investment in terms of salaries of empty homes officers and the funding that you put in to a long-winded CPO and empty homes management order process. And all of that, of course, will be accelerated and can really happen at scale if we have all those national powers that we want. So more resource to bring empty homes back into use, simpler, quicker, cheaper CPO powers, those planning powers that we talked about that would be really useful as well, and unlimited council tax premiums on long-term empty homes. That's what will enable us to actually justify putting in resource in locally at the kind of scale that you're talking about that we want to see.
Thank you. Will?
I think that we've got to begin to link together lots of different campaigns around this around the country. I think we've got to work out how to make all these local battles that are going on, and they're going on everywhere around this issue, and how to make that into a powerful kind of social movement. Because before the last elections that we've had, housing was pretty much at the top of the agenda. Really interesting around with the NHS actually. So there is this kind of, you can just feel it's a national crisis that we've got here on housing. And you were talking about generational change. I am just glad, I hate to say it, but I'm really glad I'm not in my 20s now. Really glad, because you just wouldn't get anywhere near to affordable housing. So there are lots of different generational issues where we can bring together a coalition of local community organisations to put this up the political agenda and to force concrete solutions. And I think that's one of the things we have to focus on. And it's a big job, but I think it's doable. And there are lots of brilliant organisations out there doing stuff. Just Space being one of them. Across London, there are lots of organisations, and across the country. We just have to kind of construct a national coalition that can bring huge pressure to bear in terms of policy and in terms of people doing things as communities, campaigning around the issue. I think that's one of the things we have to focus on.
Can I just quickly ask you as well, someone's asked, what is beneficial owner that you mentioned?
Well, a beneficial owner is, it's about, you might have somebody who is registered as a landlord on behalf of somebody who owns the property. And this might be an offshore trust, for example. So when we're talking about overseas ownership, I prefer to talk about overseas ownership rather than foreign ownership, because if you look at Kensington and Chelsea, 1 in 8 houses in Kensington and Chelsea is not occupied. 80% of those homes are owned by trusts based in UK trust islands, like the Virgin Islands. So actually it's UK people doing tax avoidance and looking like they're foreign owners. Now they are the beneficial owners. The people who own those properties are the beneficial owners, but they hide behind lawyers who they make their landlords. So you need to know who the landlord is and who's really making the profit out of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Harps, do you have a comment to make before we move on?
Yeah, so Andy's question was about sort of releasing more empty homes into use at a quicker pace, given the scale of, and I know it's in Southwark too, so given the length of the housing waiting list. I think things have been mentioned before, like using compulsory purchase orders and monitoring and stuff would have to come, funding would have to come from national government. I suppose there's not really a quicker way of being able to do that at the moment, as well as where they're just sort sort of owned by individuals, not larger bodies, encouraging them to be brought back into use in some way, but still maintaining that ownership. I don't know, but it's just quite tragic, isn't it, that we're in a situation where councils have sold off land and assets in terms of council housing, and then now having to buy it back to then be presented as council housing, when before it was seen that that would be making money for the authority, that they're actually losing it. And I think we really need to, losing the money, I mean, and I think we really need to that just kind of needs to be stopped. But I do appreciate that Leo's mentioned about how where there is an option to purchase back housing to then it be let out as council housing, that should be explored now. But it's just a sad situation to be in.
Thank you very much. I've got 2 questions that have been submitted by people who are currently at work. So these are Southwark focused questions. So Leo, Councillor Pollak, we would like a response to the petition that was submitted to Southwark Council at some point last year, with Southwark Defend Council Housing, and people who signed it include Action on Empty Homes, Southwark Group Tenant Organisations, Southwark Law Centre, so some of the groups here represented here. So there is 6 demands. So if I can just go through them to try and get a response. So number 1, call a halt to all council house demolition. These demands were made during the first lockdown, and obviously now during this lockdown, they still remain. And so call a halt to all council house demolition, Leo?
So I would definitely call a halt to any demolition and redevelopment of council homes that doesn't produce a significant net increase in council homes. But I wouldn't agree with an in all circumstances prohibition on any redevelopment of council housing stock, just because there might be building safety reasons why you have to redevelop, or kind of compelling reasons relating to housing quality and density. But proposals that come forward for redevelopment should always be done in really close collaboration with residents. When it's a comprehensive regeneration of an estate, it has to be legitimised with a positive ballot from affected residents, which is what we're doing on a couple of estates on the Old Kent Road in the next few months. And as you probably know, we changed our policy partly in response to the issues around displacement and loss of council housing stock that had happened in a previous period. So we changed our policy in December 2018 when we created the Great Estates Programme. So any new redevelopment proposal, this is codified in council policy, has to have a net increase in council homes to better meet housing need. Otherwise, what's the point? It has to have a right to remain for all affected residents to keep communities together. Otherwise, what's the point? It's got to have deep involvement of residents in the design process, and a positive ballot of affected residents where it's a comprehensive redevelopment. That's just one of the 6 things. So I wonder how long that might take. I'm happy to respond to some of the others kind of briefly.
So refurbish and open all council homes to house the homeless and those in temporary accommodation, including homes on the Aylesbury estate?
Yep, so we're doing that already. We've currently got over 1,000 homeless households who are living in council homes at the minute that have been refurbished for that specific purpose. There's 317 at the latest count that I've seen, households who are living in temporary accommodation at the Aylesbury. We refurbished a further 103 at the Ledbury at the beginning of the lockdown, when we had this kind of urgent need to get families who were in sort of shared hostels out of those, because it's really unsafe with COVID, and into self-contained accommodation. Obviously, when we've got blocks that are marked for redevelopment, we're always looking at the most economical way to bring as many of those homes into use for homeless families. So I generally agree with that one.
Okay. Support to shut the sites for non-essential buildings should take place. So again, now we're in a lockdown, so building workers should be paid full wages and deployed on refurbishment of council housing.
So I mentioned we're doing a lot of refurbishing of council homes, and those repairs officers are paid full wages. We haven't put any of our repair staff on furlough. I wouldn't agree really actually with an absolute requirement to shut all sites, because I think it is, I know this is not always a popular view, but it is possible in certain circumstances to create a COVID secure construction site and to really minimise the risk of transmission and put obviously the safety of construction workers first. But there's things you can do like reconfiguring entry and exit points, you know, making sure you've got hand sanitizer at all places. You can stagger shifts and breaks. You can make sure that the scheduling of transport and deliveries is done to minimise the risk of transmission. And of course, you need to have very regular testing for construction workers. Most of our sites actually did stop for a long period during the first lockdown. And the ones that did continue, the volume of work dipped significantly. So it just slows down the delivery of council homes. And, you know, we're talking about the acute need to be building social housing and the urgency. It's a housing emergency we're operating in. So I've been reluctant to have a complete shutdown of construction sites, but obviously we've got to put the safety of our construction workers first.
Okay, thank you. Requisition quality empty homes from private and housing association landlords, owners after 6 months.
So that's pretty much what we've just been talking about, isn't it? You know, requisition, I was sort of looking up the 1914 Defence of the Realm Act, the 1913 Emergency Powers Act that allowed you to requisition properties at scale. They're not on statute anymore. I think the compulsory purchase powers don't enable us to do that in the way that we've been talking about. But obviously, we've been talking about, you know, making a compulsory purchase, which is, you know, essentially the same thing, a lot swifter, simpler and cheaper, so that we can bring empty homes back into use.
Okay, thank you very much. All non-essential planning decisions, including approval of major developments with majority unaffordable homes.
So if you were to halt all planning decisions, then you end up just frustrating the delivery of affordable homes. And again, like residents contributing to planning applications, our planning officers, our planning committee have carried on working in virtual environments over during the lockdown, and they deserve a lot of credit for the work they've done. Since March, last March, when the first lockdown came in, we've been able to give permission to over 800 affordable homes in Southwark. So had we followed that particular demand, those would be, you know, significantly frustrated in their delivery. I should also add as well that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we're proactively looking to secure options to purchase a number of new housing schemes that are currently either complete, like the ones we talked about at Peckham Place, or under construction. And those are, in effect, converting homes that were given permission for private sale into what would be social rent council homes. So I generally agree with the gist of the demand, but not necessarily stopping all planning decisions, because that doesn't get us anywhere in terms of bringing forward affordable housing.
Okay, final demand. Consider expanding the definition of key workers to include frontline workers in food shops, delivery drivers, cleaners, carers, postal workers, concierges. Prioritise these workers alongside homeless families for requisition properties at council rents.
So we adopted an intermediate housing eligibility criteria in summer of 2019 that talked about key workers being prioritised for lower middle income affordable homes. I don't know that our Empty Homes Action Plan would be specifically talking about what types of eligibility we'd be prioritising for any homes that we're able to bring back into use that are currently long-term empty. But I would say that, you know, we've got our housing allocations policy that are basically the rules for and the criteria for judging who has first access to an available council home. So we're obviously prioritising homeless families, people fleeing domestic violence, under-occupiers, people affected by estate regeneration, and overcrowded families, as well as people whose medical and welfare have medical and welfare issues linked to their housing. But of course, we've got that consultation that's going live at the end of this month for a few months. So those specific ideas, I'd encourage Defence Council Housing to contribute to that consultation. We can consider it springtime.
Okay, thank you very much for everyone's patience in going through those 6 demands.
And forgive me, Rhiannon, I have to shoot off into another meeting, but just a big thank you to you for organising this, and to Will, Harps and Mark for contributing, and everyone for joining the discussion. It's been really, really helpful, and do follow what we get up to with our MT Homes. Thanks very much.
Yeah, equally, Leo, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Okay, everyone. Sorry for those who didn't have time to answer questions. Hopefully we've managed to cover everything. We're hoping that this can be a network called the Housing and Land Justice Network in Southwark, and where we do more of these kind of roundtable discussions. You'd all be welcome to join us on that. I'm just going to stop recording now. Thank you.